The 5th book of Paws of Stars, Fading Light, has now been released, and as always, the link is in the description. I'm generally really happy with how this one came out, and the stakes are certainly ramping up in the way I wanted them to. I'll save the particularly detailed description for a much later day, but as a quick summary for anyone who may not be aware, Paws of Stars is my 7-book rewrite series, combining and altering the stories from Power of Three and Omen of the Stars. It is a relatively canon-compliant series, without many huge or story-defining deviations from the original. I instead focus on slowly altering each element, from characters to lore to plot lines, one moment at a time in order to eventually get the story that I think could have been in the series originally, save for a few alterations that are definitely all my own and would never have been put in the original books. One of the areas in which I had to make more changes than usual is in the Dark Forest, a place that, in the original, only had 15 cats, most of which were charisma-free toms from a very short section of history already seen in the books, and which didn't have a plan strong enough to remotely succeed against the 60 clan cats and hundreds of Star Clan cats, even if all 16 of their trainees somehow decided to fight on their side. And even that was rather unlikely to happen, considering that the trainees were only ever told that they were there to make themselves, and therefore their clans, stronger. A lie that doesn't lend to getting the Dark Forest any loyalty, and both would and did quickly backfire when the trainees were then told to attack their clans. Suffice to say, the Dark Forest needed a bit of an overhaul, and while many of the steps needed to fix it were done in story and lore choices through the writing of the books, part of it involved fleshing out the cast of characters the Dark Forest had to work with, both by expanding and defining backstories for existing characters, and by adding several new ones. Back in January, I described 2 of the first Dark Forest cats I thought up, Ebony Star and Fawnskip. Today, in celebration of the new release, I'd like to describe a couple more. There will be a few minor spoilers for the first 4 books of Paws of Stars, and you can skip to this timestamp if you'd like to avoid those, but a fair amount of the information I'll provide might not make it into the books at all. It's just the backstory of 2 lost souls in the Dark Forest. The cats I'd like to talk about are actually a pair that both exist in the canon books, but not in quite the same way as they do in Paws of Stars. I'd like to introduce you to Snowtuft and Silverhawk. Snowtuft in particular is probably very familiar to many of you after the Broken Code, and Silverhawk was there too. But keep in mind that I wrote up these profiles far before the Broken Code had concluded, so the details that art came up with, for the most part, don't show up in my versions of the characters. Unlike many of the closed groups that formed in my version of the Dark Forest, Snowtuft and Silverhawk didn't know each other when they were alive. In fact, they didn't even live at the same time. But they were both RiverClan cats who ended up walking the same path in death, and aiding each other as they padded along it. Silverhawk was the first of them to be born, and in life he was quiet, cold, lacking in empathy or patience for any other cat. From his perspective, RiverClan didn't really need the other clans, and never had. Even Riverstar only joined them out of convenience. They had their own territory that no one else would cross, they had plenty of resources, and they had no need for the other clans. That attitude made him remarkably popular, and he eventually became deputy. However, he refused to participate in battles, instead sending small patrols of elites when fighting was absolutely necessary. His clan never hated him, but all of the others did. StarClan sent a message that RiverClan needed to rejoin the other clans, and he told StarClan to shut up if they wanted RiverClan to suffer just for some alliance. StarClan struck him down soon after as a warning, and he found himself in the Dark Forest. He was alone there for quite a while, and came to understand its rules, even feeling a little grateful that he was alone and free to do as he pleased, just as he had always wanted. But that wasn't meant to be forever. Back in the world of the living, Snowtuft had been born. He had grown up on stories of the groups of clans only barely managing to defeat big, scary bad guys, and to some extent, he liked the idea. Being a strong and formidable villain seemed like a better option than staying as the forgotten little runt while all of his peers continued to grow up, do great things, and forget about him. At least this way, he could be important to them by giving them someone to fight, a final boss to strike down on their way to success. But he didn't exactly get very far. He tried to attack one of his denmates, but they passed it off as a play fight, and he only got in trouble with the leader. Then he tried to bring in a bigger crew of rogues to attack their camp with, and the leader of those rogues decided to kill him and go through with the plan herself, slashing him from his forehead to his tail and leaving a thick, ragged scar that didn't even disappear as he faded into death. He appeared in the Dark Forest as well, but miraculously, he found himself across from another cat, who was shocked to see him. Snowtuft didn't realize it yet, but his entrance was exceptionally odd. Cats didn't find each other here. It simply didn't happen. One of the graces of their afterlife, if you asked Silverhawk. In truth, it was Snowtuft's mother, Silent Shade, who unknowingly gave him the chance. Snowtuft was born as an only kit, and Silent Shade died when he was a new apprentice, so she always pitied her poor, unassuming son as he tried to find a place in the world. When Snowtuft died and didn't appear beside her, Silent Shade wished with all her might that he could find someone to be happy with, wherever he was, and ended up bringing the two of them together. She got in quite a bit of trouble with StarClan for that, but her wish was carried out. Neither of the Toms would ever come to understand what allowed the two of them to break the rules, but it turned out to be a good thing for both of them. A week into their acquaintance, Snowtuft began to admire Silverhawk for his skills in navigating their endlessly winding paths, and his stoic nature that apparently didn't even mind the place he had wound up in. Silverhawk kept him around just as an experiment at first. What was so special about Snowtuft that he had found his way to another cat, immediately upon his death no less? But after a couple of moons of being together, he couldn't help another question edging his mind. What was special about him, as a cat? Snowtuft certainly wasn't the grandest of villains or the most somber of Toms. There was a levity to him and a resistant open heart about the world that Silverhawk could barely understand, especially given where he had ended up. Snowtuft finally told him about the origin of his scar, from a cat he hired betraying him. Silverhawk felt a rush of anger, and explained that of course he shouldn't have trusted anyone. Ultimately, you can only make yourself strong, and leave everyone else to fend for themselves. But Snowtuft just tilted his head in confusion. "But I can trust you, can't I?" he had replied. "And you know I'm not going to go away. Maybe I could after everything I learned here, but I don't want to. I like having you around." Something about him spoke to Silverhawk, opening up a level of closeness and even protectiveness that Silverhawk hadn't ever felt before, even for his own clanmates. This wasn't a relationship built on convenience, or curiosity, or dependence. Snowtuft just wanted to be with him, and he couldn't help feeling the same. Was this what made Riverstar join the clans? What made him accept in other cats in the first place, even when he could do fine on his own? This type of feeling. So yes, they got together, and as a true couple of mates who traversed the forest together for seasons, growing as a pair and keeping themselves sane and entertained as time went on. The Dark Forest never really punished them as much as it did the rest of the cats. There was no hunting to be done, and their dark, misty forests were only occasionally broken up by a small stream to revisit their swimming skills in, but they weren't alone, and they weren't unhappy. They were content to live there forever. It is only at the beginning of the Paws of Stars story where Silverhawk felt a sensation that he described as the winds changing, and decided they should try something else, bringing in a couple of living cats so they could determine what was going on from an outside perspective. They chose 2 apprentices from different clans, Mousepaw of ThunderClan and Minnowpaw of RiverClan, who seemed to have an affinity for each other despite their separation. Their visits began as training and information-gathering sessions, but the cats, soon warriors, Mousewhisker and Minnowtail, had more fun chatting with each other and their mentors, and started to develop a partnership and romance similar to Snowtuft and Silverhawk's. Despite his ever-persistent lack of trust, Silverhawk began to appreciate his apprentice, and Snowtuft's, more than he planned for. He didn't learn much from them, but they were fun to have around. Until, that is, Mousewhisker died. He did go to the Dark Forest, but as was customary, he was separated from Silverhawk, Snowtuft, and even Minnowtail before he found the way to pull her in through her dreams. It certainly made it more relieving when the Dark Forest's walls were mysteriously torn down, and the 4 cats were finally able to reunite again. And that's their story. I'd like to thank everyone again for your interest, both in Paws of Stars and this YouTube channel. It's been a genuine honor getting to share all of my thoughts, stories, and little headcanons with you, and I hope you enjoy the 5th book, Fading Light, if you decide to read it. The link is in the description, as I mentioned. And for the rest of the video, I'd like to take the time to really thank you by sharing some of the wonderful fan art you've made for me. All of it was sent either to my Twitter account or in the fan art channel of my Discord server, both of which are linked in the description. But you can also send image files or links to other image sites through my contact email. For the record, I asked permission from every artist whose art I am showing today. And in addition to the names I have listed here, I have provided a list with social media links in the description, if anyone would like to check some of these artists out. In addition to that, I'd like to make it clear that no one is ever, or will ever, be obligated to draw fan art. I don't expect anything, and I'm only showing it now as a way to appreciate the effort people put into these drawings. I've saved every piece of fan art I've ever received, and I am so grateful for it and all the support I've gotten. I genuinely couldn't thank you enough for any of this. But I know of one more way I can try. So I'll end as I always do and say, thank you for watching.